Hello, hello everyone. It's a minute after 3:30, and I want to welcome everyone to our Resiliency Kit webinar, How to Keep Hope Alive in the Darkest of Times, Communicating Ukraine. My name is Slava Melnik from TechSoup Europe, and I'm joining today from our Warsaw office, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Basically, Resiliency Kit series came about in order to organize a learning space and to equip activists and civil society with skills, knowledge, attitude, and inspiration necessary to navigate our complex realities when it comes to topics like using social media for good causes, countering disinformation, digital safety and security, and communications. In 2 months, we will mark 2 years since the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, and for many of us and our families, it was 2 years of struggle, 2 years of grief, fear, and anxiety. Yet, 2 years of awe of Ukrainian people, their resilience against all odds, their strength and spirit. 2 years of certainty of victory and hope that keeps us strong. And today, I'm very glad to start this webinar and introduce Val, our today's guest. And today we will explore the strategy behind Ukraine's triumph over fear through the art of storytelling. Together, we will learn how to create narratives that inspire action and change. We will hope to gain some practical tools to craft impactful stories that resonate globally. And with this, I want to introduce and give the floor to Val Waszczewska, a Ukrainian human rights activist and digital strategist based in London, who has dedicated her career to empowering civil societies across the world in Europe. Val, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Slava, for this introduction and for also introducing a little bit. I'm sure everyone is very close to this topic anyway, but to introduce the last couple of years for us as Ukrainians as well. So thank you for that. So as Slava said, I am a Ukrainian human rights campaigner and digital strategist, and I spent, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 5 years running the digital and social media teams at Amnesty International based in London. Before that, I actually started my career in the media. I used to work for Newsweek magazine, also in social media. And since Russia's full-scale invasion, I decided that I had to use the skills I acquired over the years to help Ukraine somehow. And since then, have also been able to use my own channels to communicate Ukraine to the world, particularly focusing on foreign audiences outside of Ukraine, because that's what I've spent most of my life doing, building international solidarity between different causes. So here I am today in the hope of sharing some lessons, sharing some tools with all of you, and explaining Ukraine's resilience in the communication sphere in the way that the story of Ukraine has been translated to the outside world. So that's what I'll do today. But before we start, and I actually maybe now well, let's see. But Slava, if you can share our little poll about effective communication, I'd like all of you to vote on what, yeah, you can, do you want me to explain? I can explain.
You can explain, and after you do that, I'll add some things too.
So I wanted to ask you before we start, and of course you can see hope in the title of my presentation, but in your work, what do you think is the most, what have you seen being the most effective tool to convince people to help join a cause, and particularly your cause?
Exactly. And while you're thinking about the answer and your specifics of your work, I just want to also mention that we'd love this conversation to be as engaging as possible, considering the format. So feel free to use the chat window. We would also gladly address the questions that you have in the Q&A session after the presentation, where we'll also be monitoring the chats as well. And our meeting is also recorded, and we will be making it available after our webinar ends. So do not worry about losing the slides or what you see, as you will have it also after that. And by the end of our meeting today, we'll also ask you to take 2 minutes to fill in the survey, but you will get it automatically. Now back to you, Val.
So I think also, Slava, tell me when everyone has voted. I'm actually very glad to see that, not glad to see, but I'm interested to see that hope has been the top voted. 12 people out of 16 have voted for hope. A lot of people, some people have also voted for anger. And this is basically the main discussion within the sphere of purpose-driven communication about what is more effective in convincing people to do something about what's happening in the world, or about specifically the cause that you're working on. But I wanted to ask this in the beginning to actually take us a step back. And I wanted to talk about hope in a way that perhaps will take us away from this, you know, kind of dichotomy of anger versus hope in communication. And I wanted us to think a little bit about change as something that drives all of us. I think that is why we're all here, that we're all trying to change something in the world. And I hope that also what connects us is the belief in the fact that something will change in the world, so that we're not ineffective. You know, we think if we thought that nothing was going to change ever, we wouldn't be doing what we are doing right now. And I wanted you, so that you can also meet a little bit each other, I wanted you all to put in the chat, what are you trying to change in the world right now? So any topics you're working on, issues you're working on, but what is the actual change you would like to see in the world based on the work that you do? Feel free to just put it in the chat so everyone can see a little bit and understand a little bit more about why you're here, and what you are here to learn more. Okay, so we have increase in technological literacy. Yep, it's really important, really cool. Anybody else?
Also, make sure when you answer the question, make sure to mark that you want to send it to everyone, not only hosts and panelists. That way, everyone will also get to know about the things you do.
I know that we have 16 people on here, so decarbonizing our future. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Increasing culture of peace. Center grassroots in the fight for human rights. Grassroots activists, sorry. Mental health for survivors, victims of war. Less narrative how free markets will magically solve all problems. Thank you. You guys can keep dropping it in the chat. Bringing more structure in the chaos. Transparent work with public institution on human rights, gender equality, GBV. Thank you. Basically, as you can all see, we're all trying to change something for the better, right? We're trying to change something to make the world slightly better than it is today. And sorry, and to me, hope is the belief that something can change for the better. For me, hope is not all about positivity, you know, happy clappy language, emotions and things like that, but it's actually just the belief in the fact that something can change in this world and make it a little bit better than it already is. So I believe that people who work in the sphere that we do, and based on the amazing things that you put in the chat, we are all doing hope-based work because we all hope and believe in the fact that we can change the world. But what I'm going to talk to you about today a little bit is I'm going to actually show you a recipe that you can use in your own day-to-day work in terms of communication. It's not something that is super groundbreaking and you've never heard about, but it's something that I use to remind myself about how to structure communications for purpose-driven issues that is based on hope, in the belief, based on that belief that I said, that, you know, we can change something for the better. Because if we don't believe that we can change something for the better, there's no point of doing what we're doing. But it's no secret that people react with emotions and act on the emotions. And so I'm going to talk to you about a set of strategies that we can use, and a set of strategies that actually Ukraine used to convince the world to be hopeful about our future. And it's a brief recipe for you. But before I do that, I of course have to say that with communications, there's always external factors that impact the way that people respond to what you're doing. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is that internal drive, and our proactive ability to structure our communication in a way that can also trigger people to do something to support us. So we usually end up somewhere in the middle. There's, you know, external factors combined with our internal drive. Understanding of external factors combined with our internal drive is usually what leads to success. So I base a lot of the work that I do on the work that Thomas Coombs, who used to be also with me at Amnesty International, but he's my mentor for a lot of the communications work that I do, on his theory around hope-based communication. And just as I said that, you know, hope is the belief that we can change something, Thomas says that hope is the belief that tomorrow can be better if we make it so. And a very useful way to, as Slava said, you'll have these notes, but a very useful way to think about hope-based communication, again, as I said, moving away from this, you know, language of positivity that people associate with hope. This is some of the things that we can move from and to as communicators when talking about our causes. So instead of always talking about fear, we can talk about hope, we can talk about change. Instead of always talking about problems, and actually we're all quite, a lot of the time, and I can speak from experience even at Amnesty, before Amnesty, after Amnesty, it's really important to understand the problem that you're trying to solve, but it's also really important to move away from putting that as the basis of your communication strategy and moving towards communicating solutions to the problems. Because if we keep talking about problems, then of course that can also have a very, and I'll show you why, based on research, can have a very limiting effect on the way that people can receive information. So again, instead of always talking about what we're against, we should talk about what we're for. And instead of talking about threats, we should be talking about opportunities. And again, this is a really, really important one, but we tend to focus on talking about victims, and in some instances it's really important, but it's also really important to talk about heroes. And as you can see that, you know, the very basis of hope-based communication is not rooted in positive kind of language and fluffy, I don't even know what to call it, but it's actually based on very specific communication tools that we can move from and towards. So this is something that that I always recommend doing, and the reason for that is that you know, we've seen, and Brené Brown, who talks a lot about communication and various other things, she says that shame is, you know, not an effective social justice tool because you can't shame people into being better. And essentially, this is something that guides a lot of the hope-based communication thinking. And we've seen, I actually think we could all, if we had more time today, we could all bring up so many examples where shame usually backfires in terms of getting people on board. And the reason for that is that, you know, there's a basis in this, there's a basis to this in linguistics and psychological research. There's a lot that has been done in the United States, but essentially, when we talk about hope-based communication is the most effective when we talk about persuadable audiences. So audiences, either persuadable audiences, the undecided, people in the middle, and then also those conflicted by different arguments. And the reason behind it is that we can actually convince them based on values, that something can change and they should support this change. And yeah, as I said, there's the research that has been done, and I mean, I'm not what is it like? I'm not a scientist in this area, but there's been a lot of research that's been done that actually our brain, which is how we see the world and how we process the world, reacts differently to different types of communication. As we said before, we react with emotions to emotions. And usually when you use fear, when you use, in a lot of ways, shame, you tend to trigger the downstairs brain, and a person starts to process things with their survival, in going into survival mode, right? So when you use language that is, as I said, more focused on shaming people and anger and things like that, you trigger anxiety, worry, and stress in people. And what that makes a human's brain do is that because you go into survival mode, you straight away go into self-interest mode. You don't really want to help anyone, because what you want to do is be able to help yourself in those moments where you feel like there's a threat. And a threat from someone either shaming you, or there's a lot of anger, and that makes you withdraw. But if you're able to trigger the upstairs evolved brain, the one that's the analytical part of your brain, with and there's research that shows that hope and the words that we spoke about, the frames that we spoke about earlier, if you trigger the upstairs brain, then you're actually able to trigger the feelings of abundance, confidence, and joy in people, and that opens a human being up to compassion and empowerment. Of course, different people differ in general, but this is a very baseline sort of understanding, and it kind of, if you think about it, makes sense. So essentially, when we receive stimuli, communication and stimuli from the world around us, our brain is like analyzing and interpreting all of this, and then it tells us how to respond. So when it senses that something is threatening, it goes into shutdown mode. But when you trigger empathy and compassion, the person is more likely to support and join you. So this was actually, this recipe post that I did was something that I published perhaps a couple of months into the full-scale invasion. I was doing a lot of communication work myself. And it started as an Instagram post and grew into essentially into this workshop that I'm doing for you. And I have to say that things have progressed and changed, and there's always, as I said, external factors that adapt things, but I think it gives a really good basis to an understanding of a whole-based approach and the parts of the recipe that you can use in the work that you do. So it has 4 main components, which is the foundation, which is our values. The second one is our heroes, our messengers. The third component is solutions and not problems. And the final one is, creativity and adding a little bit extra personality to the communication work that you do. So I'm going to take you through it. But I wanted to start with values. Values lie at the very basis of whole-based communication, but I think they lie at the basis of any communication for purpose-driven causes. And when you are trying to convince people who are undecided and bring them on board with you, so not people who already support you and do stuff for you, but when you're trying to convince people who don't support you, bringing in the shared values that we have is really, really, really important in trying to convince people to come on board with your cause. So think about Ukraine, and I'll tell you why I put that time cover there in a second. But I wanted to ask you all, what have been some of these values at the basis of the communication that Ukraine and Ukrainians have been doing since the beginning of the full-scale invasion? And of course, keep in mind that things have, shifted and changed. But what would you say have been some of the values at the heart of communication from Ukrainians, whether that's government or ordinary people online. If you can put that in the chat as well, we can go through them. Resilience, yep. Peace, yep. Solidarity, for sure. Humanity, democracy, yep. Justice, for sure. Feel free to drop in more than one if you can think of them. Anybody else? Courage, yep. You see, there's so many different values that we all hold close to our hearts, and you know, different people hold different values closer, but I think the baseline values allow us to baseline our communication. And why I think Ukraine was really powerful in communicating in the very beginning is that there was a really strong set of values that were basically, you could see them, you could feel them through everything that was communicated to the outside world, particularly in the first year of the full-scale invasion. So everything from, you know, as some of you said, bravery, freedom, unity, hope, resilience, all of these things were so powerfully communicated that even foreign media took on those values. And you can see the cover of Time magazine, and it says basically that life will win over death and light will win over darkness. And that essentially is such a strong piece of hope-based, value-based communication that quoted our president. So as you can see, values and hope were at the basis of a lot of the things that Ukraine was communicating to the outside world. And the reason why I think it was so powerful is that as human beings, we tend to, you know, simulate what we see. We repeat what we see in the outside world around us. So how were these values embedded in our minds as human beings? Sometimes you need words. So there was a lot of powerful, you know, copy-based posts for Ukraine on Instagram and across other platforms. Everything from, my favorite one is the one in the middle, which, you know, it doesn't actually, you don't have to write the actual value to be able to communicate it. So, you know, saying 603,000 square kilometers of home, you know, that communicates a value, which is unity, which is a lot of other, you know, things that you can interpret for yourself, but you don't actually need to name the value to be able to translate the value with words. As same as the one on the right, the devil works hard, but Ukrainians work harder. You know, that communicates resilience without naming it. And, you know, sometimes you can use really strong language and words to communicate your values. But sometimes you actually don't need words. You don't always have to write your values to be able to communicate them. And sometimes values are seen through imagery, communicated through imagery. So I wanted to ask you to, I'm going to be asking you a lot of these questions, so be prepared to answer in the chat. This particular image, I don't know if you remember it. It was this woman who saved a lot of disabled dogs from the outskirts of Kiev when things were pretty horrible there, and a lot of people died, and she did it anyway. So what value does this communicate? If you can put it in the chat. To you. Humanity, compassion. Yep. Yep, absolutely. Empathy. Exactly. Then there was a lot of videos as well that came through from Ukraine. You know, there was a lot of footage of people doing unusual things in unusual circumstances, in bomb shelters. You know, this woman was playing a violin, and you'd think, you know, why would the Guardian or anyone else want to communicate that? But actually, it's also an example of a very strong piece of value-led content. So what value do you think this particular image video represents. Also put it in the chat. Yep, hope, resilience, culture, yep. Anybody else? And you see how an image can communicate many different values at the same time and how different people will interpret them differently. There was also this image that I thought was really beautiful, which I mean came from Mariupol, with this young teenager wrapped in a Ukrainian flag. What value does this represent as well for you? Just drop it in the chat. Determination, yep. Sticking to values, yep. Perseverance, right? Sticking to values. Yeah. And of course, this image I thought I remember it from the very beginning, which was of a Ukrainian soldier with a little bird, and it went super viral as well. Also communicating values. To me, it just shows, like, you know, at that point in time, people were like, you know, even the nature is on our side. It's like unity and I guess compassion, because there's this like kind soldier with this little bird, and it was just quite smart in communicating our values as well. But without values, you know, you can't go any further. But to make value-based communication even more powerful, we have to have heroes to communicate those values. And you know, throughout the time that Ukraine was communicating with the outside world, we had both a symbol of resistance for the first for a while and up until now, and then we also had everyday acts of courage. So heroes can be different, and it really depends when you're communicating to a specific audience who they relate to best. As one of my colleagues now says, when you're planning a campaign, always think about, like, you know, who would be the best person to go on your you know, daily news show and talk about your cause in a way that would trigger people's emotions. In Ukraine, there were many different symbols of resistance and acts of everyday courage, and I was wondering if you had any images that come to mind, any people that come to mind who communicated the story of Ukraine to the outside world and the values with them. Just also feel free to put in the chat. Any like stories you remember of people? Slava, I know you remember.
Yes, well, for me, for the most part, it's like the first picture you showed, like the humility, humanity in the most extreme of moments.
Yep. Yeah, I see people say Zelensky, little girl singing Frozen song. Yeah. There's been a lot of different ones. Mykolaiv, water tanks, and how people survived for a long time without hardly any water. Yeah, ordinary people, right? Ordinary people were a symbol of that heroism, and they were the heroes themselves. I remember there was, I don't know if you remember, like the, you know, farmers with tanks who were, now they're like demining their own fields with their tanks and stuff like that. But there was so many, you know, unusual symbols, unusual people that communicated the story of Ukraine. But what I like to always ask is essentially, why are messengers that inspire important in convincing people to act and support? And the reason for that, I already brought this to you, but people tend to imitate what they can see. So if there are people that can relate to a specific messenger and can see themselves as part of the solution, they can feel actually inclined to act, because they can say, that could be me, and they can feel inspired by the actions of someone else. And this is like, I tend to use this to explain this point that, you know, people are like almost like chameleons. You see something and you imitate that. If you see bravery and hope, you or if you don't imitate it and don't act in the same way, you at least want to support that cause. So if you see people taking active actions to support your cause, heroes that are actively doing something to support your cause, you want to help as well, even if in the slightest of ways. So in Ukraine, it was everything from leaders, from, our president, as many people said, Zelensky, who was, now he's going around all the countries. In the very beginning, it was so important that we saw him not leaving Kiev in the first weeks, as I'm sure that there's a lot of protocols and things like that, but him doing his live streams from outside the office of the president showed to everyone else in Ukraine and to the outside world that those values of resilience and hope and all of these things. For sure. I see someone in the chat is saying Kalush. We'll get to Kalush as well. My favorite story is, those everyday acts of courage, which is, there was this woman who allegedly knocked down a Russian drone with a jar of tomatoes, pickled tomatoes. So, even, and that went super viral because she was just like an ordinary person who was also taking up in some way the fight. Since then, people we've worked with, incredible people, incredibly resilient soldiers who, got injured but kept going and nothing could stop them. People like Tyra, who was a medic that was evacuating people from Mariupol, who then ended up in Russian captivity, but since has been released and has been talking about this as a messenger. And of course, a lot of the people who have been injured by missile strikes and as a result, but have done incredible things, like this little girl who continued, she was a gymnast, she got injured and then continued her training as a gymnast. And this is just a little bit more examples of campaigns that communicate values and that communicate through heroes. So Vogue did this big piece on different Ukrainians who, got injured as a result of Russia's actions. But this communicated, resilience, and they presented them in a way that showed how strong and brave they are, and that communicated this to the outside world. And this is a campaign we did with these brilliant frontline heroes who look powerful and strong. And Tyra, I've also told you about already, super important. So as I said, values is important, but having heroes communicate those values is the second part of your recipe for success. The other thing is that we gave people solutions and not problems, at least in the very beginning, but ever since then as well. And I'll take you through some of the ones from the beginning. But, Ukraine has been really powerful in not just talking about how bad Russia is and how bad everything that's happening is, but actually saying, we need weapons, we need this. Articulating solutions has been extremely powerful. And the reason that makes your communication powerful is that we need to feel like people need to be made to feel that they can be part of the solution and that there's still hope and we're not helpless, but helpful. We're often told what not to do. So like, don't do this, don't do that. But we as human beings are rarely told what to do. So if we can tell people what they can do to help our cause, that's extremely powerful. And I think Ukraine was particularly good at doing that. So, in the beginning, when we were talking about close the sky over Ukraine, then there was a whole push for ban Russia from SWIFT, which was successful. Then it was corporate campaigning against companies where we were like, pull out of Russia. We were telling people what to do, and then arm Ukraine and so on. Instead of just talking about our problems, we were also talking about our solutions. And I think that is what made us as communications kind of leaders extremely powerful and communicated everything we did extremely well. And this goes back to what I was telling you about the brain. When we make people feel like they're helpful and not, nothing they do is ever going to help, we trigger their upstairs brain. We make them intrinsically, compassionate and empowered and trigger abundance, confidence, and joy, instead of making people feel like nothing can be done, everything's terrible, you know, and always presenting people with problems, and never with solutions. I think what's really, really important is knowing how to articulate these solutions. And also the second part that a lot of people tend to forget is, how do we see ourselves in making this future? And how do we see others? So what is the solution, and how can we be part of that solution? And how can our supporters be part of that solution? So I wanted to take some time for you to put in the chat what you, in the very beginning, you highlighted to me what the changes that you want to see in the world. But I'd like you now to spend some time putting in the chat the solution that you would like to help you achieve the change. Like, what is the solution to the change? How can you make the change happen? And how do you see people as part of that? So if you can just write that down in the chat as well. I hope you're all busy typing your answers to this.
Meanwhile, we can repeat the question then to stimulate the thinking.
What is your solution to the problem that you're trying to achieve, to solve? And how do you see yourself in making this? And how do you see others as helping you in that? So I'll go back to the example in Ukraine. We had very clearly articulated solutions. Ban Russia from SWIFT, close the sky over Ukraine, stop business in Russia, stop funding the war, arm Ukraine now. All of those are solutions, and not as clearly articulating what the role of people is in that, but I think within the wider communication that was also super obvious. Increasing the appeal of technological know-how and democratizing cybersecurity. Define a problem, break it down into small pieces, and address them one at a time. After some time, it will all build up to battle a certain issue and not get burnt out. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good one. Amplifying the voices of activists and showing how impactful they can be when resources and power are shifted in their direction. That's a really clear solution and a really clear way of showing how everyone can be part of that solution, how you can be part of that solution, and also everyone who you may want to join your cause can be part of the solution, because it's very simple. It's in the beginning, right? Amplifying the voices of activists. And as I remember before, you said, you know, showing how important grassroots work is. So the next part is that, you know, what I want to say is that, first of all, is that celebrating Ukraine doesn't necessarily mean hating on everything else. As Ukrainians, we want Ukrainian voices to be heard and celebrated. And so it's also really important for us, it was really important for us to show our personality as Ukrainians and to show all the different parts and the diversity of our identity to get people on board. And I think this is important for every single cause as well, because essentially we need to be able to make sure that people, their upstairs brain is, you know, working. Humor is such a big part of that, right? Remember, we spoke about joy and the feeling of the feeling of joy that triggers compassion. History, you know, giving people a little bit more information about Ukraine from our own perspective, culture, and creativity. All of those things make you process things again with your analytical brain and make you way more open to receive stimuli from the world and join specific causes. So instead of, you know, these are just tools that help you add a little bit more to your communications plan. So you have your values, you have your heroes, you have your solutions, and then you add some of these things that can help you in communicating your cause and making people support you. So Ukrainians were quite good at all of these, and someone mentioned Kalosh before. I think I have a slide on this here as well. But, oh yeah, it's right here. So just some examples of how wide that went. You know, when the Ukrainian band Kalosh won Eurovision, they included so many elements of Ukrainian culture. And I remember receiving so many messages in the beginning, like when they won, being like, oh, what was that flute they were playing? Or what was that thing they were wearing, from foreign friends? And I think it was just so powerful in communicating to the outside world that Ukraine has its own culture, its own traditions, and it was just such an important part of communicating with the outside world about who we are, and in making people more empathetic towards Ukraine as well, and towards our cause. Some examples of humor, you know, in the very beginning, there was this viral video from Zmyiny Island when Russian warship approached, and, you know, the soldiers there said, Russian warship, go fuck yourself. And that became like a slogan. But since then, there's been a whole kind of uproar of different creative humor-based communications of Ukraine. This is a meme from Saint Javelin. Saint Javelin has been really, really powerful in the work that they do with humor, with comedy, with making people feel more open to Ukraine, and feel like this is part of our identity as well, our personality. So this meme was quite funny, but they've done loads, and there's a lot of Ukrainian comedians communicating with the outside world. But in general, there's been a lot of humor in a very dark situation that has allowed us to ourselves to process things better, but also those we're communicating with as well. Creativity has been absolutely incredible. There's so many different Ukrainian artists producing incredible work. So many different protest actions that have been happening, that have been spearheaded by Ukrainians. So many different, you know, even Instagram creativity has been amazing. And this has allowed the world again to see that Ukrainians have been extremely open to sharing their own world with everyone else. And essentially, this is a super simplified way of building a communication strategy. So as you saw, I just took you through this very briefly, but we have 4 main components, and there's much more to this. I encourage you to also remember the from to slides that I showed you. So from fear to hope, from problems to solutions, from victims to heroes, when you're doing this work. But essentially, it's classic storytelling, right? In storytelling, you will always have values that you're communicating. You will always have heroes that represent those values and communicate those values. You will always have somewhere you're moving towards, your solution. And you will always add personality to be able to get people on board. So this is a recipe that was, in my opinion, it's an unplanned recipe for the work that Ukrainians have been doing and the way that they have been communicating, because this all happened on a grassroots level. Of course, now looking back at it, it just is such a good example of how values and heroes and solutions and personality can be used to communicate a cause. But this is something that you can apply to everything that you do. And when I run this workshop, usually offline, what we do is I give each of you a printout of this, and maybe that's something that Slava can share. Yes, because I forgot to send it to you before. But I have a template of this that you can use and fill out for your own causes. And I actually recommend that you do this on an organizational level with people that you work with who might not necessarily do communication, but that you can all sit down and think about the values of the work that you do, right? And just write them down. Think about the images that can communicate those values. So at Amnesty International, you know, we always had freedom as one of our big, or equality and freedom as our big values. But how do you communicate that in an image? How do you communicate that so that people can really relate to it. And, for us, it was really important to communicate that we were led by our supporters, so that it was, coming from the grassroots and all the way up. So images of people going out to protest on the streets, people doing stuff, ordinary people doing things to help others, was the imagery that we usually went for to communicate our values. But for everyone, it can be different. And all of you have said so many different things about your causes, the work that you do, that I think you can apply this to the work yourself and to your work yourself. And you can also think about, like, if time were to cover you and your cause, what would you want the cover to be for that? How would you communicate the values that you represent to such a large audience? The second thing, you will think about your heroes. For, as we said, you need to understand your audiences, and we can do a whole other workshop on understanding audiences. But different, heroes work for different audiences, but having heroes is so important, because you need to show people that ordinary people can be part of something extraordinary and can be part of the cause. So for a lot of you, it will be your supporters. For some of you, it might be your beneficiary, like people who you're trying to help. For different people, it will be different things. But it's really important to think about who would be the best at communicating your cause to the outside world. And then, as we said, having really clear solutions and not always talking about problems is really important. So, instead of always focusing on, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example, that everything is terrible and, saying that the government is not doing this, the government is not doing this, it would be great to say, what should the government do? And raise your communication to a level that gives the solution as well as highlights the problem. Because then people can be, because then people can see exactly what they can do to be part of it. And the governments can also see what they can do to be part of it. And then finally, as I said, personality, like creativity, history, culture, humor, are all super, super important in adding to people opening up their analytical brain and not going down into shutdown mode. So I know a lot of purpose-driven organizations struggle with this part, but I actually think it's something that's really important. And we did this in various different ways at Amnesty, but I really recommend that you think about what that is for you, because this also develops your brand as an organization and allows you to communicate better with the outside world about who you are. So I know I'm done 10 minutes a little bit earlier than we were meant to, because I went really fast at one point. But I'll hand back to Slava, and I know we have some time for questions as well, right?
Sure. If you do have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat window or on the live on Facebook, and we will be managing that. But I think the first question can be from me, Val. I was just, as you were presenting, I was thinking about the hope, and from your experience, considering also the risks of war awareness that we hear about and we see across the region, how do we keep it up in a way in the situation that people might start to feel hopeless because of various things, including the gray weather outside because it's December?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
So I also think that in this particular instance right now in Ukraine, I think that solutions, being a little bit more clear on solutions, would probably be a little bit more helpful. And we have been, right? Like we do talk about arming Ukraine, but I think we need to give people different options for how to end the war, right? To give people different routes, different solutions, because it's such a big thing. So we're working on a campaign right now around the need to disarm Russia, not just arm Ukraine, but to also, there's a lot that Western governments can do to prevent Russia from getting technology that is necessary to produce weapons. It's about keeping your solutions fresh, developing new solutions, developing alternative, like basically more and more, like as time goes on, it's important to have solutions that make sense and provide solutions that, so for example, we had ban Russia from SWIFT. Once that was done, we had to come up with a different solution. So it really depends on, remember I was talking about those external factors, to keep updating your solution, and thinking about new ways of getting people to open their sort of intrinsic ability to help and willingness to help. I hope that answered it. But I think solutions is the key to keeping hope alive, because as soon as people don't see solutions to a problem, then you lose hope, right? You're like, there's no solution. But as long as we keep our solutions updated, and as long as we keep our solutions strong and relevant to people, then I think, and doable. And remember, like that part that I was saying, when we explain to people how they can be part of them, I think that's what keeps people interested, and people interested in helping.
So is it in your experience the solutions are the most adjustable part of this recipe, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, I think all of these things are adjustable depending on your situation. I think values maybe less so, but heroes, you can, as I said, depending on the audiences that you're trying to reach at a specific time for a specific cause, you might want to change your heroes as well, right? Like you might, just for Ukraine, ordinary people is always going to be a strong kind of communication hero, but leader. But I think there's different ones. You can go from, I don't know, soldiers to medics to the president to, I don't know, as I said, like that young gymnast. So you can shift a lot of these things. But I think as soon as people stop seeing solutions to a problem, that's a big problem. And I'm not highlighting. And so my solution to that big problem is to be better at articulating solutions to the outside world.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that we have also a question from Anne. Does this apply to you as a communicator as well, as focusing on the solutions, something that helps maintain hope? I think for you.
Yeah, for sure. And also, like, you know, for us, as Slava, you said, like, I can tell you our problem is that there's now, I don't know, growing apathy and, as you said, fatigue, right? That's the problem. But what is our solution to that? Like, if we were not able to outline that for ourselves, then, you know, our job as communicators is like completely irrelevant. And I think as a communicator, that's just so important to focus on solutions as well for yourself. And I mean, you know, you can apply this to everyday problems that you have. I think as soon as, if you're able to come up with a solution to the issues that you have, then I think it's really important. And, you know, the reason actually why all of this thinking was developed is that we saw in the world a sharp rise in populism and a sharp rise in people around the world taking advantage of a lot of different audiences and being quite good at understanding people's emotional states and using that to make their communications stronger. A lot of bad populist kind of leaders across the world, you know, from Trump to whoever else. And so I think as communicators, understanding our solutions as well is super important. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, if anyone has any more questions, also feel free to add them to the chat. Meanwhile, a little bit back to what you were saying about the possibilities of rise of, you know, radical stances and elections upcoming in lots of countries across the region. Do you see the risk of our solutions being too ambitious in a way, or solutions that we want to have, as you said, they have to be realistic? Do they loosen their realism if something happens in terms of elections here and we have a different picture, a different Europe that we were when the war has started?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be such an important, it's like a mega election year, right? Because it's Europe, America, many important elections in the next year. And I mean, on a personal level, I obviously fear that Ukraine is going to be used as like a topic to fight over, and you know, it will be used for the wrong reasons in the wrong ways. to convince people to vote for one party or the other. But I think, and here you all might think I'm going back on what I said, but here actually values are really important. So you can skip between what is more important at different points in time. But I think if we go back to the values that convince people to support Ukraine, then it's much more powerful, because you have your solution, which is you want to end the war in this way, kick out Russia, keep our borders the way that they were. But the way to convince people to support that solution is by having those strong values at the heart of what you do, which is freedom, which is resilience, which is unity, bravery, which is hope. And again, that can be done, as we said, through really powerful messengers. And I think that's what we should be doing in the European Union elections. And we should be finding the heroes and the messengers that will be best for the specific audiences that are vulnerable to disinformation and manipulation as well, and go back to the values-based approach to with powerful messengers that can communicate our solution. So depending on the situation, it's really about going between these 4 parts of the recipe that I showed you and putting priority on the specific ones at a specific point in time. And I see there's questions in the chat as well.
Yes, and the question is how can we counteract voices that call for ending the war by Ukraine making concessions, and by that I think it's meant the territorial concessions.
Yeah, very easily, I think. I mean, they're doing what I've just been telling you about, right? The people who say that they are giving you a solution to the war, and I think our response should be questioning that solution, pointing out why it doesn't work. I think what's really powerful is to show how many times Ukraine has tried to, or Russia in general, has been negotiated with, and how little it's cared about any of its promises to anyone. So questioning the solutions that are clearly solutions that don't have a factual basis to them. And also not to respond, because obviously responding to controversial stances sometimes can fuel the fire and stoke the flames of their powerful way of communicating. It's to get better at communicating our own solutions. So if we don't want to end the war by making concessions, how do we want to end the war, and what can we do to be able to do that? What can we, because like now we really need to think. In the US there's this massive, obviously, this narrative, in my personal opinion, fueled by a certain state that has invaded Ukraine, around how giving money to Ukraine is getting in the way of national interests and people's day-to-day lives and the money that they get, but actually sometimes also pointing out that this has no factual basis. This is more like, I think this is more dealing with disinformation as well, right? Because these things are based on disinformation, that leads to misinformation. So people are misinformed, because actually if you look at the stats, right, like this is like a tiny part. What the US gives to Ukraine is like a tiny part of American military spending budgets each year. So it's like being factual is also important in the context of all of this.
Exactly. Well, and maybe a question to you. Oh, we have the Tom's question as well. Do you have any reflections on communicating in instances when conflicts or injustices are not well publicized or well understood, and particularly when the people most impacted want the world to hear about it? How do we balance the principle of to not focus on the problem when it needs explaining or exposing?
Well, I will ask you a counter question, but like, what problem are we talking about here in those hidden conflicts? Is that what the problem is, that people don't know about them, or the problem is the conflicts themselves? You can answer in the chat as well.
Yeah. And meanwhile, question to you about your experience. Where do you get hope? I mean, like, who do you follow to get the hopes up as a communicator as well?
Well, ordinary people doing extraordinary stuff. My brain works the same way that the brains of other people work. And so I do think, like, I follow just incredible activists from across the world, from different places, who are doing different cool creative stuff. And I mean, if even celebrities who are doing important and impactful stuff, I don't know. I enjoy following the work that Angelina Jolie does on Instagram and things like that, just showing that you can use your massive platform to, use it for good. That brings me hope as well, a lot of the time. And but just going back to the question about underreported conflicts, I mean, it's the same. I don't think you move from what I'm talking about here. You still need to provide solutions. Like, why do you need to stop this conflict? And how can you do that? Even if it's underreported, I think instead of always pointing to the problem, whatever that problem is, I think it's really important to focus on the solution of it. So I think all of this relates back to it, having powerful messengers to keep talking about it, like, I don't know, if we think about Syria, not that it's forgotten, but there's incredible heroes that have been communicating a lot of the values of the struggle against oppressive regimes and so on. So I think it's really a matter of taking this and applying it, even if the conflict is not as or the war is not as publicized. Like, I don't think it changes this recipe for being hopeful, and bringing hope into communicating that. And I mean, at Amnesty, that was like, obviously we worked in so many different places and so many different issues, that it's just important to keep this in mind, because we tend to forget as well and try to get media attention by always talking about the issues and the problems, but a lot of the times that doesn't really work. So I would just say staying with this and communicating, like, the hope, the belief in the fact that something can actually change, because I think in a lot of instances we forget to do that.
Great, thank you very much. And on that note, on the note of hope, I think we will be wrapping up today's webinar with a side note of a little homework to do, as we will be sharing, among others, a template for your recipes of how can you cook up a good hope-based communication that would be helpful in your work. Also, I encourage you to follow Hive Minds and our resources on Facebook, LinkedIn, Spotify, and the website, which will magically appear in the chat at this second. And we will be sharing the recording with you too. And please take 2 minutes of your time to fill in the evaluation survey that you will see popping up on your screen, also automatically at the moment that we end the webinar. And with that, I want to thank you, Val, a lot for opening the doors to your kitchen of powerful hope-based communication and recipes that you use.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Slava, for supporting me on this, and thank you for that amazing ending to this. It's the best one I've had yet.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.